member for Swazell Saltibo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as usual, when we are presenting on the budget, whether it's the estimates or the appropriation bill, I normally give thanks and praise, Mr. Speaker, for being around to make this presentation on behalf of the people of Swazell Saltibus and the country in general, Mr. Speaker. I also want to thank, Mr. Speaker, the people who provided me with the mandate to serve them for 5 years. And Mr. Speaker, I am hoping that based on my ability to have served, that I would be given another 5 years to serve them, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I also want very early to indicate my thanks to all the frontline workers, all the healthcare workers, to the CMO and her team, the Minister of Health, and all those involved, Mr. Speaker, in addressing the challenges that we continue to have with this pandemic, Mr. Speaker. I want to say a big thank you. Mr. Speaker, I believe it was at our last sitting, no, it was actually, Mr. Speaker, the sitting before the last, that the leader of the opposition briefly mentioned, while he was trying to emphasize a point, he briefly mentioned Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Mr. Speaker, Maslow's theory depicts that people need vary depending on their stage in life, but the very basic needs of air, food, water, shelter, clothing, and sex are the foundation of the most important. And these are the basic needs, Mr. Speaker. In fact, they are what is referred to as physiological needs, Mr. Speaker. The reason I am raising this, Mr. Speaker, because it is my intention to highlight this evening how, as a government, we are moving people up the pyramid by teaching people, Mr. Speaker, how to fish, and not deliberately giving the fish, not deliberately giving $5 to block a hole, and keeping people, Mr. Speaker, because, Mr. Speaker, by giving the $5 to block a hole, what we continue doing, Mr. Speaker, is keeping people in a dependency cycle. Mr. Speaker, I have come to the realization that there is a lot of hypocrisy in politics. Because, Mr. Speaker, you cannot be in opposition and keep shouting, the Mali way, victimization, victimization. And when you come into office, you forget about the Mali. And it's away, first class. One man getting all the road contracts.
That's right.
It's affirmative action.
That's right.
Mr. Speaker,
Tell them.
when will this narrative stop? When will this narrative change, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, we live in an enlightened era, and people no longer swallow everything wholesale. No longer, Mr. Speaker. The people no longer swallow everything they see or hear. People, Mr. Speaker, can drown the noise. And right now, Mr. Speaker, because of the enlightenment age that we live in, people can do their own fact checks, and they don't let others think for them. And so, Mr. Speaker, I will emphasize how this government continues to create opportunities for our people to grow and become masters of their own destiny. Mr. Speaker, I know this evening that the leader of the opposition alluded to creating a youth economy should they be allowed to return to govern the country. Really, Mr. Speaker? Really, Mr. Speaker? The leader of the opposition has been governing for 15 years, Mr. Speaker, in government. and only wants to speak of building a youth economy now, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, it reminds me, Mr. Speaker, of jobs, and pumping 100 million almost immediately into the economy, Mr. Speaker. Did these promises materialize, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, our approach in creating a youthful economy and building the entrepreneurial spirit, as indicated in our last debate on the estimates, is to start with the schools, Mr. Speaker. One such example, Mr. Speaker, is what we term Young Entrepreneurs in Action Program, the YEA. And this, Mr. Speaker, will be driven by the Small Development Unit in my ministry, SEDU. And we will be targeting junior achievers from select secondary schools, from varying social and economic backgrounds, to cultivate entrepreneurial skills. This will be done through apprenticeship, mentorship, internship, and job shadowing. And we will be assigning them to our SEDU clients every summer for 2 months, Mr. Speaker. A stipend will be paid by the government. Mr. Speaker, I'm very happy that the Choiseul Secondary School was one of the schools selected for these programs. We anticipate, Mr. Speaker, that this will, 1, expose students to options for self-employment upon graduating rather than seeking a job. 2, educate students on the life of an entrepreneur. 3, motivate students to start their own business. So, Mr. Speaker, from school, the students move on and they have a business idea. And they come and they visit SEDU, Mr. Speaker. And SEDU will be holding their hands from the conception of the business idea and will provide business management advice, market and product development, interventions with other government and non-governmental agencies, and help formalize the business at significantly reduced costs. Last year, Mr. Speaker, savings to businesses just to register and incorporate was just a little over $1 million. And concessions to these small businesses, Mr. Speaker, was just in excess of $1.5 million. Mr. Speaker, as a direct result to amendments made to the Fiscal Incentives Act in December 2019, if these individuals are involved in the following services sectors, and I wish to list the sectors, Mr. Speaker. 1, creative industry. The leader of the opposition is just learning about creative industries, Mr. Speaker. Right. And creative industries which include motion picture projection service, entertainment service, sporting and other recreational service, motion picture projection and videotape production and distribution services, information and communication technologies, which include telecommunication services, online information and or data processing, including transaction processes, spa and wellness, which includes beauty and spa, physiotherapists, and services provided by midwives and paramedical personnel, medical laboratories, professional services, Mr. Speaker, which includes accounting services, management consulting services, photographic services, architectural services, engineering services, integrated engineering services, printing and publishing services, veterinary services, medical and dental services. Mr. Speaker, if anybody involved in any of these sectors or services that I have mentioned, Mr. Speaker, based on the amendments to the Fiscal Incentive Act, Mr. Speaker, these individuals, Mr. Speaker, would be able to receive duty-free concessions for any raw material, packaging material, a vehicle if it's integral to the business, anything, Mr. Speaker, that they bring in from overseas, they will be able to get duty-free concessions, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, shouldn't the opposition be applauding this initiative, Mr. Speaker? Shouldn't they be applauding this initiative? Mr. Speaker, this is why I continue to say that
I am not a politician. Because, Mr. Speaker, if I was on the opposite side, I would applaud such an initiative. I would most likely say, spread it more, give some more. But I would applaud such an initiative, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, rather, the opposition seeks to spin things, Mr. Speaker. A recent regulation put in place, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that certain activities are done in a controlled environment, and then you hear, Mr. Speaker, nous quand empêcher malheureux faire boudin. Nous quand empêcher malheureux faire bon. Somebody even said, Mr. Speaker, that Bradley wants a license for people to plant potatoes in Choiseul. Mr. Speaker, mischief. Spinning, Mr. Speaker. That's not how you should behave in opposition, Mr. Speaker. Because, Mr. Speaker, a lot of what is being said and spun, Mr. Speaker, is not true. I remember, Mr. Speaker, in fact, Mr. Speaker, any butcher, and the member from Labrie knows that. He knows that very well, Mr. Speaker. Any butcher who sells commercially, Mr. Speaker, any butcher who sells commercially must get the permission from public health before selling. That's a fact. Mr. Speaker, I remember as a young boy in the community of Choiseul, some fishermen went out to sea one day, and Mr. Speaker, they came back with a cow. They came back with a cow, Mr. Speaker, because the cow fell over a cliff, fell in the water. They didn't get any fish for the day, so they put the cow on the boat to come and sell, Mr. Speaker. Thankfully, Mr. Speaker, public health intervened, and that meat was found unfit for consumers. That is why you need regulations in these sectors. Members opposite, or member opposite. You require these regulations, Mr. Speaker. Would you, Mr. Speaker, through you, I will ask the member opposite, would he want somebody to make a charcoal pit outside his bedroom window, Mr. Speaker? Would he want somebody to make a charcoal pit outside his bedroom window, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, the way the opposition spins this thing, Mr. Speaker, is mischief. They want us to live like we're in the jungle, Mr. Speaker. We're in an environment where regulations are necessary.
That's right.
Mr. Speaker,
That's right.
I deviated a bit, Mr. Speaker, but I want to go back, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, very importantly, Mr. Speaker, in these amendments that we made, Mr. Speaker, it must be noted, these amendments were passed in September last year. It was not a COVID initiative, Mr. Speaker. This was just a common sense approach, Mr. Speaker, to assist major drivers in the economy. And you were there for 15 years, and you could not have common sense approach, Mr. Speaker. Now with COVID, Mr. Speaker, and the extent of businesses affected, government will therefore now have to consider expanding, Mr. Speaker, the various sectors who receive concessions and incentives. And we've started, Mr. Speaker, and because we know how hard hit the taxi sector, the bus drivers have been affected, we have included concessions, Mr. Speaker. They have been hit hard, Mr. Speaker. That is not an election gimmick, Mr. Speaker. That's a fact. No election gimmick. Mr. Speaker, an election gimmick is when you try to put up an administrative center 2 months before an election. 2 months before an election. And you don't even have title to the property. That's an election gimmick. That is what political hypocrisy is all about.
The highest level.
Mr. Speaker, I should also mention, Mr. Speaker, that effective July 1st, my cabinet has given me as Minister of Commerce the authority, Mr. Speaker, to avoid all of the time delays. You've given me the authority, come July 1st, to be able to sign off on the following sectors applying for this incentives, or for a stipulated amount, Mr. Speaker. And that is a government that is thinking, Mr. Speaker, of ensuring that there are no bottlenecks in the system, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, we understand, Mr. Speaker, that we're in times where government needs revenue. But more importantly, Mr. Speaker, we have to help. We have to help our people. And Mr. Speaker, I can tell you that we have estimated from these incentives and concessions that will be given to the service sectors, the government will be losing approximately $57 million annually, Mr. Speaker. $57 million. Isn't that the government trying to assist its people, Mr. Speaker? Or trying to assist small business? Mr. Speaker, to go further, this government has encouraged the training of young people in new sectors, which is one of the reasons, Mr. Speaker, we have been encouraging, by invitation, the business processing outsourcing centers. Mr. Speaker, and we saw government providing income support towards the initial hiring of hundreds of young people at the Ojo facility in Beaufort in the area of artificial intelligence, one of the fastest growing IT sectors in North America. Mr. Speaker, I'm still reminded, Mr. Speaker, that the opposition continue to refer to this sector as mind-bending. You want to create a youth economy, but you cannot relate to what's trending, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, we live in an environment now, particularly with COVID, Mr. Speaker, where we have to encourage investment in non-traditional sectors. We have to think out of the box. Who can we invite? How can we get our people, Mr. Speaker, to invest in areas other than what we have known along the years, Mr. Speaker? And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, as a Prime Minister, this is the kind of thinking we do in Cabinet almost on a daily basis when we meet, Mr. Speaker. Thinking out of the box. How can we bring in new business into this country, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, we will soon be seeing another state-of-the-art business processing unit opening in Beaufort. Itelbo Smart Solutions, Mr. Speaker. We're expecting to see initially 150 young people being employed, Mr. Speaker, and in a matter of 6 months, that figure should be increased to 200. Mr. Speaker, jobs, Mr. Speaker. Real jobs, Mr. Speaker. Not supporting young people to go and work. And not that, Mr. Speaker, I'm beating it because there is a place for everybody, but not supporting people to go in a hardware store and bag or to fix up various shelves, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we're building intellectual capacity with all of this. Y'all were paying for people to do that. Bag groceries. Mr. Speaker, how can members opposite be serious about creating a youth economy when after the introduction of VAT in 2013, it took this government in 2017 to defer the VAT at the port on raw materials and capital goods for manufacturers. Manufacturers, Mr. Speaker, were stifled. They were stifled as their cash flow was hindered, having to pay upfront for an item not yet produced, Mr. Speaker. You hear that, Mr. Speaker? They had to pay upfront for an item that was not yet produced. Mr. Speaker, since I'm on manufacturing, Mr. Speaker, I should also indicate that this government has also extended exemptions from income tax for mature manufacturers entities for an additional 5 years based on the level of new investment made. Savings in that area, Mr. Speaker, can now be used to reinvest, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, talk about helping small businesses, Mr. Speaker. Facts, Mr. Speaker. SLDB relief loan stimulus, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this program, Mr. Speaker, is not all about getting a loan. As much as the loan will be given at very concessionary rates, Mr. Speaker, this program has a grant component to it, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I expect very soon, the Prime Minister did make the announcement in his earlier presentation, Mr. Speaker, but very soon, Mr. Speaker, we will be giving a more elaborate context of how this program will work, Mr. Speaker, because currently there's some fine-tuning that is ongoing. So I do not want to say anything, and it has been changed in the process, Mr. Speaker, but this, Mr. Speaker, I can assure you will benefit hundreds of small businesses in the island, Mr. Speaker, because between the loans and the grants, they range from $25,000 up to $200,000. Mr. Speaker, I will move on. Mr. Speaker, this government has continued to ensure that as much as possible, basic food prices are kept in check. Currently, Mr. Speaker, there is a loss of $12, Mr. Speaker, on every bag of flour sold to bakers. We buy a bag of flour at $97, Mr. Speaker, and we sell it at $85. I think that is called a subsidy. So when I hear members opposite saying that we have removed the subsidy, Mr. Speaker, I question their objective. Spinning, political hypocrisy, mischief. Again, Mr. Speaker, in consideration of the impact of COVID, we will be further reducing, Mr. Speaker, by an additional $5. An additional $5, Mr. Speaker. So from July to December 2020, Mr. Speaker, bakeries will be able to buy a bag of flour for $80, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to take the opportunity to indicate, Mr. Speaker, that in an effort to meet the needs of the vulnerable and the wider population, this government, Mr. Speaker, provided 500 100-pound bags of each of rice, flour and sugar to NIMU during the lockdown, Mr. Speaker. Consideration to the vulnerable, Mr. Speaker. Consideration was also given to other groups and agencies as well. Mr. Speaker, my ministry, in an effort to ensure that no commercial house or individual takes advantage of consumers during a pandemic or natural disaster, Cabinet has given authorization to the Ministry of Commerce to proceed in preparing an anti-price gouging regime to include penalties, Mr. Speaker. And it must be noted, Mr. Speaker, that the private sector has endorsed this regime. Mr. Speaker, an example of how this country is moving in the right direction is to examine domestic exports for the last quarter of 2020, which was at 35.2 million compared to 24.3 in 2019 and 33.5 in 2018 for a similar period, January to March. Mr. Speaker, this shows the significant increase, well, except there was a dip in 2019, but we picked back up in the first quarter of 2020. Mr. Speaker, on the flip side, Mr. Speaker, and to appreciate COVID's impact, export declined by 84% in April compared to March. That's the reality of what we're facing with, Mr. Speaker. A country that was on an upswing, all of a sudden, COVID, Mr. Speaker. So under the circumstances, Mr. Speaker, this government is doing exceptionally well in assisting our people, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one such glaring example of growth and how the intervention of exports SaintLucia with the assistance from government is our CMOS production. Mr. Speaker, exports increased from 55,000 in 2018 to 557,000 in 2019. I urge members and yourself, Mr. Speaker, to consume some more of this exceptional product because it could help in raising your awareness of local excellence. We also saw, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I am keeping my conversation within the parameters of Parliament. So, Mr. Speaker, we also saw, Mr. Speaker, Seymour's farmers increasing from under 20 to over 200, Mr. Speaker. And from reports that I'm getting, Mr. Speaker, that number is continuing to increase because the market is there and available, Mr. Speaker, for us. Mr. Speaker, also very interesting, Mr. Speaker, breadfruit exports, Mr. Speaker, has moved from 583,000 in 2018 to 1.3 million, an increase of 125%, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have recognized a resurgence of exports to Martinique and exports to Barbados continue to grow, particularly in the agricultural sector. Mr. Speaker, as a government, we must harness and capitalize on our intellectual property. And we must ensure, Mr. Speaker, that there is legal backing that is sound to avoid copyright infringement, piracy, etc. We continue with intellectual property rights training, Mr. Speaker, and, Mr. Speaker, we are really building the capacity of our young artists and other IT-driven individuals, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have brilliant IT-driven and artistic minds who create their own software and various platforms. We must, Mr. Speaker, continue to support and help them grow. The amendment of the Finance Act is one way to ensure that, Mr. Speaker, because we must continue to provide that support, but we need to go further, Mr. Speaker. Just like what reggae and Bob Marley did for Jamaica, our indigenous music can and has already started doing it for us. However, Mr. Speaker, we cannot let them, and I refer to the artists, do it alone. Currently, Mr. Speaker, Exports SaintLucia conducts capacity building for artists in performance techniques, stage management, finance costing, promotion and marketing. And as much as possible, internationally recognized managers have been used for training. This year, Mr. Speaker, Exports SaintLucia was also able to take 14 participants on a trade mission to St. Vincent and the Grenadines and Grenada, paying 95% of all expenses. And I'm happy to report that 2 of the participants were selected from the community of Saltibus. From the feedback I received, Mr. Speaker, various marketing opportunities were opened. Mr. Speaker, one of the areas which concerned me while vying to be elected, and also as a former banker, Mr. Speaker, was the number of families in my community residing, particularly in the community of PI, Mr. Speaker, who resided on lands belonging to the state, either Crown or in SaintLucia. I vowed, Mr. Speaker, to address the situation, as I understood the lack of empowerment in having a house on lands not belonging to you. Mr. Speaker, you would be amazed at the number of St. Lucians falling into this bracket across the islands. Most of it, Mr. Speaker, is acute in the community of Beaufort and Dennery. Mr. Speaker, while as minister responsible for Invest St. Lucia, I have been able to intervene in many cases in PI, but there are still so many more to be rectified. One by one, Mr. Speaker, we will deliver. Mr. Speaker, land rationalization is ongoing in 8 communities as we speak. I have advised Invest SaintLucia, Mr. Speaker, that the traditional approach of settling with people who have resided on lands for generations must be revisited. And so, Mr. Speaker, I expect to see speedier resolutions in title transfers. Mr. Speaker, Invest SaintLucia's strategic plan for 2020-21 was to create 600 new landowners. As such, an overall development plan to undertake mixed-use residential and commercial development in Dennery, Micoud and Choiseul was approved. Micoud and Dennery have been completed, Mr. Speaker. In fact, I understand that the demand for the lands, Mr. Speaker, far surpassed what has been surveyed and cut up, Mr. Speaker, for the people. Beyond more, I understand that, Mr. Prime Minister. Choiseul, Mr. Speaker, will commence within the next 2 weeks with 130 lots on approximately 40 acres in Lafarge. Development costs will be in the region of $7.7 million, Mr. Speaker. You see, Mr. Speaker, while Choiseul is one of the larger communities, extensive landholds are locked in generations of family and costly to legally formalize by the heirs. The interest in the intended development, Mr. Speaker, has seen overwhelming support and requests by Choiseulians living in the diaspora and locally, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have continued to speak and promote that we need to address the green wave unfolding in the Caribbean and the world. I am pleased to report, Mr. Speaker, that Cabinet has been presented with a report followed by a memorandum on recommendations on the way forward in having a regulated cannabis industry. Mr. Speaker, my colleagues have agreed that we are at a period where the approach must be different. And I was very pleased that the presentations from the Commission was well received by all. Mr. Speaker, the findings concluded that criminalization of cannabis has been ineffective in reducing the use of cannabis and cost the economy almost $4 million annually. Various models on the way forward was presented, Mr. Speaker, which included investment opportunities as an industry. While Cabinet appreciated the way forward, Mr. Speaker, a request to present the report to the nation by way of a televised national consultation was agreed upon. Mr. Speaker, this should have been this week, but the engagement of the staff of NTN for the budget has resulted in the first week in July being selected. I urge all St. Lucians to tune in to make their contributions. Mr. Speaker, as we prepare to launch the Love St. Lucia campaign on Tuesday, June 30th, the critical role of the St. Lucia Bureau of Standards must continue to be highlighted. In preparing the national quality policy, the goal, Mr. Speaker, is to assist with the nurturing of a culture of quality competitiveness by guiding the development and facilitating the use of an accessible, affordable, and internationally recognized demand-oriented national quality infrastructure. In short, Mr. Speaker, to facilitate our products meeting internationally recognized standards. So, Mr. Speaker, as our trading in goods and services evolve, our NQP will ensure the following: improve and strengthen competitiveness in domestic, regional, and the international markets, thereby fostering a more sustainable manufacturing sector. 2, support economic growth, national development, and increase employment through more competitive MSMEs. 3, protect the health and safety of people through innovative inspection, testing, and certification. And 4, Mr. Speaker, promote increases in agricultural sector productivity, ensure food security, and the availability of raw materials to support sustainable development. Mr. Speaker, as we launch this campaign, we must move past an all-government approach into an all-of-St. Lucia approach, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I will use the balance of time to speak to matters of the heart. Mr. Speaker, in recent times, there has been a lot of discussion of preserving our history, heritage, patrimony, etc. Mr. Speaker, on several paintings, calendars, videos, various documentaries highlighting the community of Choiseul, you will see the image of the remnants of sugar mills. Many people, Mr. Speaker, including tourists, use them as backdrops in photo opportunities. These landmarks, Mr. Speaker, I always thought belonged to the Crown, only to realize one day last year that the construction of a house mere feet away. Mr. Speaker, I was broken. Really, Mr. Speaker, I was broken. Because one of the reasons, Mr. Speaker, Choiseul Saltibus is the envy of other communities is our rolling, unobscured landscape of ridges and valleys. Mr. Speaker, I approached the PM and indicated to him that we should not allow this to be in private hands, and this should belong to the people of Choiseul. I am pleased, Mr. Speaker, that to date we have acquired the properties in Monsieur and Fiette. Mr. Speaker, I know I have mentioned it in this House before, but it is relevant for SaintLucia to know that the partial restoration of one of these mills was a young leaders school project, where the kids of Choiseul Secondary School formed a human chain, Mr. Speaker, passing stones from the river downhill. And if you are familiar with the hill, you would be proud of these students back in 1998. So, Mr. Speaker, the intention when this government gets back into office is to create 2 recreational parks, something which is lacking in our communities. One would have a stage to host traditional festivals like La Rose, La Marguerite, Soleil Couché, and also where artists can express their spoken word, where craft can be displayed to take advantage of village tourism, Mr. Speaker, etc. The other, Mr. Speaker, to be considered for celebrating special moments of birthdays, anniversaries, etc. And Mr. Speaker, this will be put in the hands of the community to manage, Mr. Speaker, and create some economic benefits, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have already begun speaking to various people about artistic designs, and there is a particular philanthropist, Mr. Speaker, who may contribute as part of his corporate social responsibility the actual redevelopment of an entire windmill with the mills and all, Mr. Speaker. So I really look forward to this, Mr. Speaker. You see, Mr. Speaker, this is what I would like the gatekeepers of our patrimony to intervene in very early to see. Not the gallows of police brutality, inhumanity, and untold horror. Like the saying goes now, Mr. Speaker, come for me. Mr. Speaker, on the night of my lunch as a candidate for the UWP, I remember asking the crowd to look to my right. At the time, Mr. Speaker, I was pointing to an accident waiting to happen at the Choiseul Secondary School. On that night, Mr. Speaker, I promised the people on coming into office that our government would break down and construct the long overdue Block B and C. I have heard from members opposite that this was an initiative of their government. Mr. Speaker, I wish to refer to a preliminary design report project background, Mr. Speaker, and I quote a paragraph on page 7, which says, the decision to replace blocks B and C with 2 new structures was informed in part by the outcome and recommendations of a structural condition assessment conducted by FDL Consult Inc. in 2011. Following alarming vibrations witnessed in Block B and C, which questioned the structural integrity of the buildings, the Ministry of Education and Culture commissioned a structural assessment of the building in June 2011. The full study is documented in a report dated August 2011. The completed structural assessment concluded that the 2 blocks were structurally unsafe and under extreme loading and a catastrophic collapse was possible. It was recommended, Mr. Speaker, that the 2 blocks be reconstructed as retrofitting to increase their service life was too expensive and would result in lengthy disruption to the school's normal operations, Mr. Speaker. That was 2011, June, July, August 2011, Mr. Speaker. Elections in 2011 was held, I think, in November, Mr. Speaker. We lost the elections, Mr. Speaker, and the party that came in, Mr. Speaker, left it hanging. Mr. Speaker, 4 years after winning the elections, Mr. Speaker, in May 2015, Mr. Speaker, the Ministry of Infrastructure, Port Services and Transport procure the services of FDL Consult, Mr. Speaker, to provide consultative service for the finalization of the architectural and structural design. That is what you call electioneering, Mr. Speaker. When you talk about electioneering, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, what this appears to me, that the construction of the Choiseul Secondary School at that time was not a priority, Mr. Speaker. 4 years after, Mr. Speaker. Political hypocrisy, mischief, spinning. Mr. Speaker, I again wish to return to my days on the campaign trail, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I heavily criticized my opponent for boasting about resurfacing some roads. And I indicated that it is expected of a parliamentary representative to attend to basic infrastructure. So, Mr. Speaker, I will not boast about blocking holes. But, Mr. Speaker, when a constituency has been crying for 25 years to address precarious road conditions and precipitous drops where lives have almost been taken, Mr. Speaker, there is a feel-good energy, Mr. Speaker. A feel-good energy, Mr. Speaker, that must be exhaled, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I refer you, Mr. Speaker, to the Prime Minister's 2012 address. The Prime Minister's 2012 address, page 48. Priorities, Mr. Speaker. The people must remember, Mr. Speaker. Page 48, Mr. Speaker. DFC projects will now be put out to tender. 2012 we're referring to, Mr. Speaker. Utilizing the process of open tendering ensures greater efficiency, transparency, and value for money in the use of government resources. Mr. Speaker, government will pursue 3 road links using this method during this financial year, 2012. 1, the rehabilitation and reconstruction of the Piai to Saltivas Road. 2, the rehabilitation and reconstruction of the Labrie to Bans-Laguas Road. And 3, the repaving of the Beaufort to Labrie Highway from Beaufort Town Center to the Gablewood South Mall. You know which one was not done, Mr. Speaker? And you talk about doing construction and contracts in your constituencies and living out. Mr. Speaker, the people of Piai Saltibus, Mr. Speaker. And so, Mr. Speaker, I am very proud, Mr. Speaker, that a promise that I made to the people of Saltibus Jetwin is unfolding before their eyes as paving of the road, Mr. Speaker, started yesterday. The economic benefit, Mr. Speaker, that will accompany this highway are endless. Already, Mr. Speaker, we are seeing the return of visitors to our waterfalls and rivers, and families are even returning to claim property, Mr. Speaker. You will note, Mr. Speaker, I did not boast of other election promises like the only road in the village of Choiseul and the Coco Road in Dakiten. Mr. Speaker, I heard the leader of the opposition speak to 25 roads being constructed during his time in office, Mr. Speaker. And he also boasted that this was done without the fuel tax, Mr. Speaker. But what he deliberately did not mention, Mr. Speaker, that a number of these roads was a design, finance, construct. And you know who's paying for it now, Mr. Speaker? This government. So, Mr. Speaker,
Honorable members,
Mr. Speaker,
honorable members, honorable members, allow, honorable member, Honorable members,
Yes, that I hit a nerve, Mr. Speaker. I hit a nerve. Mr. Speaker, on the conclusion of the Saltibus Road, Mr. Speaker, we will be paying attention to the Dubrel-Montet Road, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, we have already received estimates, Mr. Speaker, to pay attention, Mr. Speaker, to the Gayabwa
honorable
Parker
members,
State Road.
honorable members. On the last occasion, I did indicate that I'm prepared to use Standing Order 43, whether it is for a few minutes or for as stipulated for the entire session. Please allow the member to be heard.
Mr. Speaker, I'll move on, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I note that certainly Choiseul has people who have remained strangers and certainly want to take pictures with Choiseul people. I wish to remind Mr. Speaker that the best time to have taken these photos should have been in completing our mini stadium and our lights with Mr. Speaker, the Moroccan money. Politics and hypocrites. Politics and hypocrites, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in December last year, the thirst for lights at the Lafargue playing field was quenched. For the first time, Asu Square was lit, Mr. Speaker. The sportsmen and women quickly got themselves together along with a corporate sponsor, the credit union, to begin the Choiseul smash, Mr. Speaker. The parliamentary representatives also supported each team in receiving financial assistance. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, COVID suspended play, and we look forward to many more activities to enhance the skills and talent of our sporting fraternity. Mr. Speaker, the cost of the lights, Mr. Speaker, was at $672,763 US, Mr. Speaker. State-of-the-art lights for our field, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we intend to service various fields with electrical connections as a first step to providing lights and seating arrangements. Mr. Speaker, the United Kingdom Department for International Development, through the PAHO, funded the refurbishment and retrofitting of 13 health facilities around the island. I am pleased, Mr. Speaker, that free of Choiseul facilities, Lafargue, Morgouche, and Saltibus were all upgraded and provided with major generators in case of backup during natural disasters, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I continue to boast that Choiseul Saltibus has the most schools on island. And I'm very pleased, Mr. Speaker, for 3 years running, every single school in the community has benefited from various works, including replacing and retrofitting toilet blocks, fencing, replacing ceilings, tilings, doors, furniture. All these works contracted, Mr. Speaker, to local contractors. Mr. Speaker, my colleague, Minister, I'm sure will provide the comparison under the previous administration. Mr. Speaker, we are very concerned with the use, or rather, what we consider to be not maximum use of the facility known as the NSDC Center in Choiseul, Mr. Speaker, affectionately known as the Choiseul Handicraft Center, Mr. Speaker. And we have been speaking to the Minister, Mr. Speaker, with the intention of providing greater use of that facility, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have also acquired lands adjoining the Delta playing field, Mr. Speaker, and this Delta playing field, Mr. Speaker, served the communities of Ravino, Industry, La Pointe, Mr. Speaker, and Boisden, Foncillo, Diamond, Mr. Speaker. A very wide community, Mr. Speaker, and it may be one of the only facilities or areas, Mr. Speaker, without a community center, Mr. Speaker. Acquiring the field was the first step, Mr. Speaker. We intend to begin some excavating, Mr. Speaker, on the lands acquired, Mr. Speaker, with the intention, Mr. Speaker, to begin construction of washroom facilities, Mr. Speaker, for the residents and people who use the facility, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I also wish to indicate under agriculture, Mr. Speaker, the YEP Youth Empowerment Program, Mr. Speaker, in Rivadore Choiseul, Mr. Speaker. A program which had been in place for a number of years, Mr. Speaker. I think it was started under the Honorable Minister for Agriculture. The opposition came in, Mr. Speaker. Exactly, Mr. Speaker. The program, Mr. Speaker, went awry, if I could say so, Mr. Speaker. And it was only upon resuming office, Mr. Speaker, after having a meeting with the farmers, Mr. Speaker, and when they indicated to me what were their priority needs, Mr. Speaker, we were able to provide electricity and water to all the farmers under the YEP program, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member, you have 10 minutes in which
Talk
to
about
complete
not
your
doing
presentation.
anything, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this government saw the need, Mr. Speaker, to provide better water resource for the community, Mr. Speaker. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, a water pumping station was erected at Martin Choiseul, Mr. Speaker, to relieve the pressure from the Delse intake, Mr. Speaker, so that more people would have water coming out of the sink on a more regular basis, Mr. Speaker. We recognize this is just a start because there are other communities having some water pressures, Mr. Speaker. In 2020, Mr. Speaker, it is not something I think that, we should be speaking about, Mr. Speaker, but as a government, Mr. Speaker, we are doing everything, Mr. Speaker, to improve water conditions for the people of the community, Mr. Speaker. And so I expect to see some benefits very soon, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are also engaging several of our young men and women in the community in a program called the Bangolo Farm Project, Mr. Speaker. Very soon, Mr. Speaker, we will be making the announcement of the beginning of the program, Mr. Speaker, where several farmers, Mr. Speaker, will be allocated with half-acre lots, Mr. Speaker, to plant various crops, Mr. Speaker. And we intend, Mr. Speaker, not just to have it as a farming community, but also to engage, to have it as a site where people can come and see how farming is done, Mr. Speaker, and also to have what you consider community market. So the farmers will have their stalls and everything right there where people know they can come and purchase fresh produce, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Choiseul Fishermen Facility, Mr. Speaker. A facility, Mr. Speaker, that the Japanese government had given upon, Mr. Speaker, during the reign of the opposition, Mr. Speaker. Upon returning to office, Mr. Speaker, through the Commission of the International Whaling Commission representative, Mr. Speaker, I spoke to the Minister of Agriculture, and we were able to renegotiate with the Japanese, Mr. Speaker, to come back in, Mr. Speaker, and provide us assistance in solving this long problem, Mr. Speaker, of the silt building up at the mouth of the facility, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm very, very happy that the Japanese took us seriously to the point where, Mr. Speaker, they invited us to Japan, and we also took along with us, Mr. Speaker, for the very first time, 2 fishermen to see firsthand the facilities in Japan and explaining to the fishermen, Mr. Speaker, as to the approach they would be taking in resolving the problem. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, COVID set in. We have had a Zoom call with the Japanese officials, and they have indicated as soon as it is safe to travel, they will be returning to SaintLucia to continue their research and underwater exploration onto the best solution, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm very happy with the work that this government has continued to do, particularly, Mr. Speaker, in my community. 5 more minutes, Mr. Speaker? Okay. Mr. Speaker, I would also want to indicate, Mr. Speaker, that the Honorable Prime Minister is committed, Mr. Speaker, to making this country a better place to live, work, and play, Mr. Speaker. And I boldly say, Mr. Speaker, that with his support There has been more money spent in the community of Choiseul Saltibus, Mr. Speaker, than any other representative in 4 years, Mr. Speaker. I can say that, Mr. Speaker, without fear or favor. There has been more contractual obligations to the community of Choiseul Saltibus and this administration in 4 years, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is very unfortunate that some have chosen to attack the Prime Minister with baseless, Mr. Speaker, racist derogatories, which can never be healthy, Mr. Speaker, for any country, far less one as small as ours. The spreading of these seeds, Mr. Speaker, will only hurt all of us. Deep down, Mr. Speaker, we all know the truth. But we always love shallow waters, Mr. Speaker. But one day, Mr. Speaker, the truth always prevails, Mr. Speaker. And so, Mr. Speaker, I support the Appropriation Bill 2020-21 presented by the Honorable Prime Minister. I thank you.